Welcome. In this series of videos, we'll discuss weight-related bias and stigma. We have 3 learning objectives for this topic. In this video, we'll distinguish between explicit and implicit weight bias. Weight-related bias can be explicit or implicit. Let's define these terms and think about some examples of both. Explicit weight bias is defined as attitudes and beliefs that are overtly stated or acted upon. These are associations that a person holds between concepts and evaluations or stereotypes that an individual is conscious of and deliberately thinks about. With respect to weight-related explicit bias, these are concepts around weight and body shape that are associated with negative evaluations or negative stereotypes. So let's think through some examples of explicit weight bias. One example is cyberbullying on social media. Let's say an individual posts a picture of themselves and then gets shamed by commenters on this post. If the commenters are making negative comments about that individual's body shape or size, they're expressing explicit weight biases that are negative and reinforce negative evaluations and stereotypes of certain body shapes and sizes. Another example would be weight-related teasing or bullying. This illustrates an explicit bias towards someone's body that's explicitly stated and communicated directly to that individual. Even if it's a well-intentioned teasing, it still communicates a message that that individual's body shape or size is something to be made fun of. Finally, weight shaming would be another example of explicit weight bias. If an individual's dining partner makes negative comments on what they're eating, their lack of physical activity, or how those behaviors may be contributing to their higher weight, their partner is shaming them for their weight and their weight-related behaviors. Another way to understand explicit weight bias is to think about how we measure explicit weight biases that people are willing to report. One example is the fat phobia scale, which is a reliable and validated scale that is used in research. As you can see from the directions for this scale, the respondent is asked to review 14 pairs of adjectives and to indicate what they feel best describes obese or fat people. Higher scores on this scale represent higher levels of explicit weight bias. So an individual who has high levels of explicit weight bias might respond to the scale in this way. They might report that they would describe obese or fat people as being more lazy, having no willpower, being unattractive, having poor self-control, being slow and not having endurance, being inactive and weak, being self-indulgent and liking food, being shapeless and tending to overeat, being insecure, and having low self-esteem. Now let's think through the definition of and examples representing implicit weight bias. The definition of implicit bias is attitudes and beliefs that an individual may be unaware of or unwilling to report. So these are associations between concepts like weight and evaluations or stereotypes like negative characteristics or undesirability that an individual may not be conscious or aware of. These implicit biases often manifest in the reflexive reactions we have to individuals based on their body shape and size. An example of this is if we make an assumption about someone's lifestyle based on their body shape or size. If we reflexively assume that an individual with a larger body size is more likely to overeat, have an unhealthy diet, or be inactive, this is an example of an implicit bias. Another example would be a nurse who is less empathetic towards a patient with a larger body size. That nurse may not overtly realize she's doing this, but may hold implicit biases that that individual's health problems are their own doing because of their weight. Finally, we can think about examples of implicit bias in employment settings. An actress with a larger body size may not get a role because she, quote, doesn't fit the part. If this isn't due to detriments in her acting skills, but rather due to her appearance, her body shape and size, this would be an example of an implicit bias on the part of the casting director that precludes them from considering actresses with larger body sizes for their roles. An example measure of implicit weight bias are implicit association tests, which are tests where the respondent is asked to associate categories of things, like body shapes and sizes, with concepts or characteristics. And the test measures how quickly or easily you're able to relate concepts that may be more versus less congruent in your mind. A great example is the Harvard Implicit Association Test. I encourage you to visit this link and take this test so you can learn more about implicit weight bias. These tests look at how quickly an individual associates fatness versus thinness with negative concepts or qualities versus positive concepts or qualities. Typically, what these implicit association tests show is that individuals more readily or quickly associate positive concepts like flowers with thinness, or positive characteristics like motivation with thinness, whereas respondents are more likely to associate negative concepts like spiders with fatness, and negative characteristics like unmotivated with fatness as well. Indeed, research using these tests reveal that many Americans hold these subconscious associations. We see that when respondents are asked to group fat people with bad concepts, they move through the items quicker and have a greater number of correct responses. When respondents are asked to classify fat people with good things, they respond more slowly and get more items wrong. We see similar results when larger bodies are asked to be classified with more negative characteristics like laziness versus more positive characteristics like motivation. Let's review some key takeaways from this video. We can distinguish between explicit and implicit weight bias. Explicit weight bias is typically easier to see and notice. It's more overt and intentional. These are weight biases that individuals are willing to report and clearly show in their actions and reactions towards individuals with larger bodies. Implicit weight biases are typically more subtle and unconscious. They reflect our reactions to individuals with larger body sizes that influence how we act around and treat these individuals, and they may be reactions that we're not even aware of. However, both explicit and implicit weight biases negatively impact our perceptions of and interactions with individuals with larger body sizes. It's important that we become aware of both our explicit and implicit weight biases so that we can counteract them with more inclusive attitudes and practices. That's all for this video. Thank you for learning with me.